Good afternoon. I am Liz Powell. I am the founder and head of G2G Consulting, and G2G stands for Government to Growth. We are a government affairs firm based in DC, and we also have Midwest offices. We do a lot in lobbying advocacy work with a range of high-tech health innovators as well as nonprofits. And I used to work on the Hill, and now I get to be off the Hill trying to influence the process on a regular basis. We have launched this program called What's Happening in Washington, D.C. We're going on a couple years now. It's been really successful and interesting. We've got great folks dialing in regularly for this quarterly series. So I get to sort of play moderator with this. I have two esteemed colleagues joining me each quarter when we do these. So what I'd love to do is to start off with introductions, and then we'll get into some questions, and we will close out with your questions. So think about questions you've got, and you can start popping them in the box there. So with that, I would love to pass to Chris Campbell.
Hey, good morning, afternoon, wherever, or evening, I guess, wherever one is. Chris Campbell, I used to work on Capitol Hill as well. Actually overlapped a little bit with Liz. I was the staff director for both Senate Judiciary and Senate Finance, and then was confirmed to Department of Treasury, where I was Assistant Secretary. Now work in the private sector, advising some of the largest funds and families in the world, navigate a whole variety of issues. I don't do any government lobbying, but I certainly try to pull up the crystal ball as much as I can and help those with whom I advise navigate the challenges and potentially opportunities in the private sector as they present themselves from a Washington angle.
Great. Chris Oates.
I'm Chris Oates. I've never worked on Capitol Hill, but I have taken a tour there and eaten at the delicious Subway in the basement of the House office. But my background is I am a lecturer at Boston University at the Pardee School of Global Studies. I was a political risk analyst for a number of years covering the United States, and now run a software platform called Legislata for information about politics. And my position has always been more about the outside looking in, trying to forecast what's likely to happen, what are the structural changes happening. So a bit less of the day-to-day 24-hour news cycle, and more what does this mean for the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, in more of a probabilistic fashion. What's more likely to happen, less likely to happen, rather than just what you might see on cable news, which is the quick hits and quick reactions.
Great. All right. Thank you. So why don't we start off with what just happened this week, at least in Congress, with the appropriations. We averted a shutdown, had very strong bipartisan support for a continuing resolution. It's a little funky with 2 different deadlines in January and February, which is new, and adds some challenges, but it passed overwhelmingly. It's now the law, so we bought ourselves a little time. So first of all, thoughts on the appropriations process, and our new speaker, Mike Johnson, might be a good way to start off today. Chris Campbell.
Well, first of all, I was about, before the House passed the CR and the Senate can also passed as well. We should probably rename this about what's not happening in Washington. But I think it's funky. Certainly, it's something that the Congress has never approached, or hasn't, at least in my experience, approached appropriation process like this. But you know what? I don't think this Congress would be. I think this is par for the course for this Congress. There's nothing new, nothing normal about this Congress. And so I think I think it's great to have progress. It's great to find some way through this. It's great to have the House have a speaker. It's great to have, at least some optimism about the path forward potentially in Washington to get some things done. Although I'm very pessimistic about that, and kind of overall. But yeah, I think that it's I'm grateful, and as a taxpayer and an American, that the Congress was able to find a way through this and pass an appropriation bill, a set of bills of CR that kind of kicks the can down the road again. But it certainly doesn't. It keeps the government lights on and keeps our troops funded and those important things that the government does.
Yeah, and I remember the last call we had, I said I thought there would be a government shutdown because I thought it'd be in the interest of the various actors to basically stick to their red lines and not compromise for this. And I think what we actually saw was that kind of process of, it was in the interest of I don't know if we still call them Tea Party lawmakers, but the Freedom Caucus, and their crowd to kind of show that they're not going along with Republican leadership in the House. I think we actually got that in the Kevin McCarthy speaker motion to vacate. And then all of that energy kind of consumed what we thought was going to go into the political showdown of a government shutdown. So what was interesting about this one happening, and kind of, I don't want to say it flew under the radar because certainly it was well covered, but it didn't have the same kind of standoff and drama that we saw on the debt ceiling earlier this year, is that I think a lot of members of the House kind of had their energy directed to the speakership fight. And now that that's over, I think there wasn't really an appetite for another one in November. And so that might be delayed until January and February. So I think, again, moving towards the government shutdown clock, I personally think it's now more likely we're going to have a shutdown in January because of that two deadline focus, the laddered approach, as they call it. I think it becomes much easier for the House in January to say we're not going to do another congressional resolution, continuing resolution, because they're not going to be defunding the Department of Defense at that deadline. So in some ways, it was unexpected, certainly on my end, that we wouldn't have a government shutdown this fall because it looked like we were heading for it. But we also didn't expect to have a new speaker. So I think that kind of kicked the can down the road. And I think I'm not saying there will or won't be a government shutdown in January, but I find it very possible and very plausible that we would. I think the situation is right for that. But it's also possible that I think the House or enough members of the House just say, you know, we had all this fight. It didn't really lead to something. We're going to have to be passing bipartisan bills anyway. So let's just kind of do it and not go through the whole Potemkin show, or not Potemkin show, the whole show in the before of not passing a CR, having a shutdown for a few days, saying that we won't, and then passing something with bipartisan votes. I think they just kind of skipped that in this time and went straight to we're passing something that can pass the Senate and be signed by the White House.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting how time flies by, because I'm already like, oh, we've got a new speaker. Let's just keep moving forward. But you're right. I mean, it was very recently that suddenly, you know, we had 22 days of no speakers. Suddenly this new speaker, who's it going to be? Is it going to be Jordan? No. Oh, Scalise? No. You know, chaos. But I am actually very hopeful and impressed with how the majority in Congress were like, let's just function. And you're right. Let's not do all the drama. Let's just get the CR done and move right along. And so that was great. And what's interesting is I was on the Hill recently. I was with some Democrats that were like, we don't even know Mike Johnson, and like they're looking at his record and all that. And then I talked to Republicans that are like, it doesn't matter he wants to get things done. And so I think what's great is that he is showing himself as a pragmatist who wants to get things done. So you can have your whatever ideologue, your personal issues, but you're in Congress, you're working with a government that needs to get things done. So I am actually pretty hopeful that we're moving in the right direction. So related to spending, great, we don't have a shutdown, but we still have Ukraine, Israel. There's a huge movement to get childcare funding. So what do we think about supplemental efforts when they come back after Thanksgiving? That'll be another big one. What do we think about those, and how does that impact politics and how things get done and the economy? Just any thoughts on that? And this time we'll start with Chris Oates.
Yeah, I think the supplemental is going to be really interesting because of the dynamics within the House. And I think ultimately it comes down to what the speaker wants to put to the floor. And one thing that's interesting about Mike Johnson, as you said, we don't really know him, but he's still there. And what's interesting is how the numbers of the votes for this CR were very similar to the previous one. And there was a recent article I read, talking about how this is not just now, this has been for the last 10 years or so, where if you want to get legislation done when you have divided government, often what happens is that when Republicans hold the House, the resolution passes with some Republican votes and almost all Democratic votes. And it really comes down to whether the speaker chooses to bring it to the floor or not. So the reason why we didn't have immigration reform in 2013 and 14, or maybe 14 and 15, was that John Boehner, the speaker, didn't want to bring it to the floor, even though it had enough votes and would have passed along similar measures. So I think what it comes down to is, does the speaker want to bring it to the floor and have the votes be basically the same as what we have in the CR? Now, I think if you were to break it down into different individual parts of that supplemental, Israel would pass easily, border security would pass easily, Ukraine would be the challenge. And so I think that's where the standoff is. The White House and the Senate certainly know that. They want to pass everything together so that they get Ukraine in there. And I think it'll come down to whether Mike Johnson wants a big standoff on that, or whether he tries to, I'm playing hardball is such an overused term, but basically, is he going to play a game of chicken where he says no Ukraine funding, and if Ukraine funding is in there, we're not going to bring it to the floor. We're only going to do break it apart, and who blinks first. And I personally think that given that Ukraine is the biggest part of the supplemental funding, and it's really what the White House wants to do to get it done through the rest of 2024, I think they're not going to blink. And so I think ultimately it will go through. The numbers might change to give an issue of an illusion of compromise, but I think ultimately what the Senate and the White House wants will be what is overall passed by the House. But again, that is just a prediction right now, and that could change dramatically based on whether Mike Johnson thinks that his speakership is at risk, which I don't think is true, but it's always a possibility to look out for.
Yeah, my view on this is actually not too dissimilar to Chris's. I think that at the end of the day, if you kind of push away from the table, the likelihood of all three passing, or this supplemental passing, including Ukraine and Israel and the other priorities for both parties, is likely going to happen. And so it's then a matter of kind of the theater of how it happens. And I think that the new speaker is, as Liz said, a kind of a practical or pragmatic conservative. If that's true, and that's in the likelihood of that, of all of them passing, do you want to go out publicly and say that you put a line in the sand saying we're not going to pass Ukraine when ultimately it's going to happen, right? So there always is kabuki theater when you're passing these very complicated and very large bills that have political implications. But you also don't want to look like you're lost, and so you have to be very careful how you practice, how you position yourself at the beginning. And so it'll be, again, like Chris said, it'll be fascinating to see the early indications of what the speaker, how he positions himself in the conference, to be able to, ultimately get to a place where I think they're going to get to, which is all going to pass, and do it in a way that lowers the political temperature enough so that it doesn't hurt members of his party, the speaker's party, that they have to stand for re-election next year. And quite candidly, I think it's going to be a tough election environment for any incumbent next year. So I think it's hard to. As I say, you can easily paint a case where the House may flip next year because just the members that are up and the changing environment, and also perhaps the really difficult economy that we may face next year.
We're going to get into elections. Absolutely. So my next question is about taxes. So some of you may have seen my special alerts. I've been pretty active on this one issue, what we're calling the innovation tax. So this really hurts SBIR companies that have worked so hard to innovate, to get a government grant, which is very hard to do these days. It's like a 12% or less likelihood of succeeding getting government funding. And now the government is saying you're going to have to pay taxes on 90% of what you get in that grant. So this is completely disrupting businesses. Some are having to shut down, they're having to let people go, or they're just rejecting getting the grant at all. So what I find interesting is that in the CR, we all know this, when they put together these packages, they can slip all kinds of things in there. So they did ensure that the expiring farm bill programs were included, that they were extended, but they didn't touch the innovation tax. So they are forcing companies to deal with this year. If they do something next year in the package, it would then have to be retroactive. There's other business tax extenders. So do we have opinions or insights on what we think is going to happen with these types of things when they are trying to negotiate in January and February next year, which also could go all the way to April, by the way, even though they set those. So what do we think about that? Chris Campbell.
Yeah, as you know, I used to run finance, Senate Finance, which is the tax writing committee in the Senate. When it comes to, so for those that don't have to live in Washington and haven't had to live this gobbledygook, Washington has a really amazing way of overcomplicating things. It should be less complicated, but it just kind of, because the Constitution is written the way it is, their tax bills and spending bills are different, and they're treated very, very differently in Congress. And so there's a different process. There's a constitutional process for a tax bill. It doesn't have to be the same way for a spending bill. So the CR and taxes are just treated very differently. And then also, and you think spending is hard, and you've seen the drama play out of how and where government spends money, and where the parties are, and even within the Republican Party they can agree. Right? But that's complicated. Taxes is twice as difficult. So if you're raising taxes or lowering taxes and trying to find a way to open up the tax code in a way that's is difficult. So, like, let's say it this way: when you pass a spending bill, everything under the sun of how government spends money is subject to the conversation. It can be amended in a way that reduces or government or spend or reduces or raises government spending and things like that. Same is true for taxes. And so every time you open up a tax bill, you touch the tax code, the entire tax code is open to amendment. And it's very, very, very complicated. And every member of Congress, all 535 of them, want to change some aspect of the tax code. And so it becomes a very, very complicated process to get anything passed. And so while Liz is suggested something that would be deeply problematic for small businesses around the country, that are responsible for 70% of job growth and significant amount of economic activity in our country, even that would be difficult, because if you try to change that, I promise you 535 members are going to want to change something else in the tax code, and then it quickly becomes it's quixotic. It very quickly becomes so hard you just can't pass it. Liz also mentioned rightly that there is every single year Congress has expiring provisions of the tax code that they have to revisit. Most of these things are non-controversial, but they do expire every single year, and so the Congress puts together a bill called the Tax Extenders Package that kind of loops in all of those things in one vote, and that is that probably will be the only tax bill legislation that passes this year or early next, and so it would have to be put in that package, and it would then have to be deemed non-controversial by the Chairman of Ways and Means, Chairman of Finance, and the leaderships of the two bodies. And so I'm sure that Liz and people like her are making sure to try to find a way to make this as non-controversial as possible and known to members of the relevant committee members and members of leadership. But that would be the only vehicle that I see that it could when I see vehicle, only a piece of legislation that could be attached to that would be that would get it over the goal line. And I think, but I am very optimistic about tax extenders going into this election cycle, because I think it's going to be a very difficult economic time.
And I have nothing to add to that, because I think that was a great answer. The only thing I would say is that from a political standpoint, I can't really see anyone in Congress being against this. I think the tax that Liz is talking about, everyone from Elizabeth Warren to Ted Cruz, I think, could get on board with tweaking that, saying that, it's a misapplication. It's not our intent. We want to help small businesses. I often, when I'm trying to think of, the politics, it's, would a member of Congress want to be at a press conference talking about how they change this? And I think every single member of Congress would love to be at a press conference or to send out a press release saying, we helped reduce the burden of taxes on our small businesses and on our innovators. So I think you're right. It's going to be hard. It's not a certainty, but I would definitely say, I'm seeing a question about the child tax credit. This would be a much easier change politically than the child tax credit, which has already failed to be renewed.
Yeah, well, let's go there, since we have a question on the child tax credit. So often what happens, Chris Campbell knows this best, being on the front lines from working on the Hill and Senate Finance, they group things together. So child care tax won't get through on its own, but it could get wrapped into something else that's a moving vehicle. The train's already going, so let's just add this in, and it's part of the negotiation. So do you think that this will rise up? Because I've actually heard from the community that there are childcare centers that will actually have to shut down if there isn't support for them. So do you have thoughts on, could this get part of a bigger package, or do you think that it's not possible? All they care about are sort of the international issues and they won't touch it. What are your thoughts on that, Chris Campbell?
It's a brilliant question. I think the answer is it's always possible. uh, likely not probable, though. I think it's just it's unfortunately this has become a bit of a political hot potato, and it wraps up some social issues and others that are important to both sides. And so it's just it's just this one specifically is a bit of a little bit of a hot potato. I think that, and issues that I think they'll become important during the campaign. And so I think it's something that I think there'll be a lot of discussion around it, and appearance of progress. But I don't think it would make the ultimately make the package or the bill that it ultimately becomes law. Because just the raw politics around the issue, and it's again difficult, no question. I think that certainly a lot of American families will be materially affected by this, but I think it's just this and thousand other things like immigration. I think it's always frustrating because I think it becomes a better issue than a solution in DC.
Right.
Yeah, and well,
Go ahead.
just the two things I'd add to that is one is that Mitt Romney has talked about this issue before. So given his, I guess, unique position as a former presidential candidate, and he's going to be retiring, he may kind of make this a legacy project. So just not to say that he will, but if you start to see him talking about it more, it may mean that it's more likely. He has a bit more clout than your typical senator. And the other thing I'd say about this child tax credit, but also childcare incentives, is to look at the state levels. States are not unaware that this is an issue as well. So obviously, New York City has childcare credits. Some of those are expiring, some of those are being cut. But just to look at whether in the next budgetary cycle at the state level, childcare subsidies start to get involved into that as well, because that is, again, if your state has the budget for it, is a very popular issue for a governor looking to maybe move on to the Senate.
Yeah, interesting. So speaking of hot potatoes and border security, border patrol issues, and states, what's interesting is I was yesterday hearing about Massachusetts and their efforts to pass spending measures to cover the immigrants that are being sent from Texas. So what are we going to do about this border issue? It doesn't seem like everyone's upset about it, but it doesn't seem like there's ever going to be legislation on it. What are your thoughts on that? Are they going to keep shipping immigrants to other states? Like, what do you guys see happening there? Chris Campbell, we can start with you.
Yeah, look, I think it's those states that are border states: California, Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Florida. I think there's some very unique positions to have a significant challenge in state budgets, because of the border crossings. I have a lot of sympathy for those governors because they have, the protection of the border befalls the federal government. But if the border is not protected, then the state government has to bear the burden, the financial burden of those that come to the United States. And so it's a kind of a weird mismatch. And so I think that you've seen a lot of border state governors become very, very frustrated and very angry that their budgets are being significantly burdened, and so they're passing on that burden to more northern governors that are typically tend to be more blue state governors, and border governors in the South tend to be a little more red state governors, and it's created this interesting. I'm kind of looking at this as nonpartisan as I can. It's really created this very interesting dynamic where immigration has always been and border security has always been something that's been approached and embraced by the Republican Party for so long because the nature of those border states typically being Republican governors. But that it's changing that dynamic now, bringing in mayors like Eric Adams and Massachusetts and other states that are in New York that are now being their budgets are being dramatically impacted by the number of immigrants that they're having to process because they're not being processed in the south, or they're being moved north. it's created this very interesting dynamic where kind of blue and red are coming together on an issue that's been very highly politicized for such a long time. And so there may be an opportunity for a coalition that comes together to try to find some way to pass something significant on immigration. It will not happen before the election. I think the next chance would be post the 24 election, and then we'd have to determine the outcome of that election, right? Who's president and who controls Congress. But there's a very interesting confluence of politics. Kind of, it's becoming less political, more like oh crap, we have a real problem. I'm sorry, we have a real problem in our hands, and it's a significant issue that's really, I mean, like Eric Adams in New York is suggesting actually may bankrupt the city. And so it's just a real existential threat. And so I think that there may be a little bit of a ray of sun to suggest that there may be some case for optimism on trying to find some path forward, but it certainly would come, I think, first with securing the southern border, and then trying to find some way of looking more comprehensively at solving the immigration problem that we face and have faced for more than 20 years in the United States.
So on this one, I will take a different stance, because I think one thing that is actually interesting is that there are 4 states, American states that border Mexico. 3 of them have Democratic governors, and you don't really hear about like busloads of migrants being shipped from New Mexico, Arizona, California to New York and Chicago. So I do think there's a lot of political. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background. I do think there's a lot of political stuntery happening around here, especially like Florida. Ron DeSantis would like pick up immigrants in Texas, fly them to Florida, and then fly them to Martha's Vineyard. And I think there's a couple things going on. Obviously, there's a lot more immigration. Yeah, my dog's now looking out the window. I think the real issue here is the asylum process, and we don't have enough judges to quickly process that. So that's going to come from Congress. Will they pass money to actually increase the number of judges to process these cases, get them done more quickly? I don't think they're going to do that. I think a cynical person would say that members of Congress benefit from this being a crisis that they can talk about. There's no real incentive. I mean, there was possibility for immigration reform in 2007, I believe, that George W. Bush supported. There was immigration reform in 2013 that passed the Senate with like 70 votes. There are a number of people who either, for whatever reason, don't want it or benefit from it. And then when it comes to the migrants in New York, Boston, and other areas, a lot of the cost is based on the kind of adjustment costs. So a family comes to, in Massachusetts, they just failed to agree on, the legislative session ended on Wednesday. They failed to agree on how to spend $250 million on the shelter system. But that $250 million on the shelter system is about a family comes to Boston. They first, show up, they get stuck in a shelter, then they get given housing, or they find a job, they get a temporary work permit. And then all of a sudden they're just residents, having jobs, being consumers, being workers. And what I thought was really interesting about this is that New York City just put out a big press release celebrating that for the first time in a few years, the New York City school system has increased enrollment this year. They have 8,000 new students compared to what they had last year. And they cast this as this great thing. Students are coming back to New York City. But in fact, New York over the last few months have seen 12,000 young migrants who are now in the school system. So the entirety of that, New York City seeing new students is through those young migrants coming with their families. So I think what we're going to see now is on the kind of the political part of it, do they, to solve the issue, do they pass money for more security and more asylum judges? That's the big thing. And on the state and city levels, there will be costs associated with the adjustment. But then in a few years, those migrants that are currently a burden are going to become productive residents unless they've gone back to their home countries. So I think what is going to be interesting to see is at what point does that turn over? And at what point do cities start saying like, wow, our economy just grew by, a little bit. And with most of that growth being new residents, new workers. There are a lot of other issues that would come from that, especially like in New York City and Boston about housing affordability and availability. But, I think there's a great study done of Florida and the wave of migration that happened from Cuba in the I believe it was 80s or 90s, and the economic impact of that. And it was largely positive because basically you got a bunch of new workers, a bunch of new consumers. So if that's the long term, and the question I think for the politics is at what point does the initial adjustment costs turn into just your population grew by a lot of working age people? But I know that's not something that's currently discussed in a lot of political media right now.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. Well, Chris Oates, I'm now going to direct this one to you because you are all about political risk. You're always assessing what is happening in politics and how that can affect businesses and the economy. So let's talk about politics. I'd love to talk about what's going on in the Republican Party with the new speaker, with where they're going to go. I think many are exhausted with the spending. There was so much spending during COVID. There's a real movement to cut, go way below the budget deal. Then there's many moderates that are also frustrated and exhausted when they want to get back to getting things done. So Republican side, there's lots of interesting dynamics. Democratic side, there's also interesting dynamics. People are getting primaried. If they're not liberal enough, then they're primaried out. And then, what happens in general election, then they lose. So it's just interesting. I mean, both parties are experiencing that. So what do you see within the political party system? And then let's get to elections. There's lots of retirements that are affecting things as well. So what are your thoughts on all of this and advice for folks?
So I think there's definitely the thought that, people are going to be facing primaries if they're not ideologically extreme enough. I think that happens in some cases, but it's more likely on the Republican side than the Democratic side, historically speaking. And just in terms of ideology, Eric Cantor lost his race mainly because of ideology. When it's happened on the Democratic side, it's often not ideology, but some kind of connection with the district. So we think about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez primarying her representative as a kind of left-wing versus moderate type thing, but it was also the fact that Joe Crowley, the representative, basically didn't live in the district anymore. He lived mostly in Washington, and also the district's demographics had shifted. So he was kind of an old school Archie Bunker type white outer borough person. She was Latina, and the district had shifted more towards that. I think there's one representative from Michigan who's an Indian American businessman, represents Detroit. There's already been announcements of primaries against him from local Black elected officials. And it's the sort of thing that he won his primary 2 years ago in a multi-party, multi-candidate split. So again, it kind of makes sense that he would be primaried. But I think it's also important to note that it is difficult to primary someone. And so even though there are talks of primary challenges, they very rarely succeed. And I know that we often, the political media likes to talk about the primaries, but there's this huge selection bias. They talk about the ones that actually win. And just for the numbers, there was a great documentary from the 2018 cycle that featured Representative Ocasio-Cortez and also a few other liberals who are running against incumbent Democrats. Everyone else lost other than her. And so it's just important to remember, while they talk about it, it doesn't necessarily happen. I think what's really interesting, though, is how the party system, if we just want to take a step back and think about the parties, is how the party system is really starting to fragment. And the parties currently don't have a lot of power anymore. You hear about Democrats being worried about Joe Biden being too old, but there's really no mechanism by which the party could tell the sitting president not to run again. And then we see on the Republican side, well, in 2016, the party, if there were a party apparatus, would have been against Donald Trump. That didn't really matter. Currently, there were quite a few party officials, again, if you want to take a more general approach, that seem to want to get behind Governor Ron DeSantis back in November of 2020. That didn't seem to work either. So I think what we're going to be seeing is a continuation of candidates can drive at the national level and parties don't have a lot of power. When it comes to Congress, though, it's very different because leadership does drive a lot more. And I think you're absolutely right. Republicans don't want increased spending. Given that they control the House, I think they're going to get their way. And so if I had to predict anything, I would predict largely flat spending measures, which would be suitable for Republicans because they could say, we held spending in check. I used to live in Nicole Malliotakis's district in Southern Brooklyn. I got mailers from her saying we held spending flat. So it's a win for her. And for Democrats, they can say they prevented Republicans from cutting. So I would say that is in the benefit of both parties, because in Washington, as you know, party leadership really does matter. When it comes to elections and races, I think it's much weaker.
Yeah, like I think where I disagree, I think Chris is. I think that both parties are there's still a race to the corners, and so I think you have these weird political shifts going on. Right, you have the mayor of Dallas, an African American Democrat, becoming a Republican. You have Kirsten Sinema in Arizona, a state that last cycle went pretty blue. Now is became an independent because she was going to get primaried. So it's there's just so many, and so it's just I get this weird shift going on in American politics where I think that if you're a mushy middle, or if you're the 80% of Americans who actually are not the 20% on the ends. I think it's the ends are still shouting loudest, and that 80% are being drowned out. And it's kind of I operate at that 80%, so it's kind of frustrating for me. So I think that's going to happen. I think more broadly in the scope of as I see the 24 elections happening, as I've said many times in these conversations, that I think most times elections are based on first economics and kind of kitchen table economics. So do you feel good as a consumer? Do you feel like you can feed your family? Does all that stuff work? And then if you can get past that and say yes, that's great, then you can go into more social issues that are really important. The only thing that put on that is abortion can overtake economics, but absent abortion, it's just I just think that there's a lot of headwinds economic headwinds are going to come into the focus in 24. And if that is the case, and I just think it's a really bad time to be an incumbent in general in DC. I don't care if you're a Republican or Democrat. I just think if you're running for re-election, it's going to be a really hard time because people are just going to be really frustrated. I can go through all the stats, but wages are increasing at less than 1%. Inflation is at or above 3%. So that's a 2% at delta for most Americans. Most Americans, 60% of our country live paycheck to paycheck. Savings rates on an annual basis are 8%. During COVID, they were 30%. They're now 3%. And Americans are now moving to consumer lines of credit, so credit cards to buy things. So we're now almost $1.1 trillion collectively in credit card debt at a 25% or more interest rates. All of that means, and student loans came online last month. All of that means that Americans' monthly budgets are going to get squished really hard going into Christmas. I think that most American families are going to what I call the Santa bounce. They're going to really dig deep to make sure that Santa Claus comes. But January is going to be very, very hard. And if that's the case, I think most American families are going to be in really difficult times, and will likely see a recession. And if that is the case, and if I'm correct, then I think that it's just a really difficult time to be an incumbent in DC. Most American voters make up their mind on the economy in an election year in April, which means that wherever we are at the end of Q1 is likely where the American consumer is going to be going into November 24. I project that we'll be in a recession at the end of Q1. So if that's the case, I think it's going to be just a very difficult time. I think that so in that vein, I'm largely predicting the House becomes a Democrat, the Senate flips to Republican, and Donald Trump likely will become president of the United States.
Whew. All right. That is not happy news about the economy, and you put it out there, the prediction for 2024. Where I see a question on abortion and somewhat related. I mean, there's this huge turnout that's happening. These states are now passing laws on this issue, and in spite of Dobbs, it seems to be this movement towards states now enacting abortion rights access. But related to that, also the White House just announced this new White House Women's Health Research Initiative. There's sort of a bunch of movement and sort of women coming out and voting. So I hear what you're saying about by April, you say that's when folks pick their candidates. Um,
On the economy. It's just, yeah, it's where they kind of, that's where they're,
where the economy is at
yeah,
that time.
exactly.
Okay, that's how they pick. So, but could there be an additional factor here of all these women, I guess, are now coming out to vote, and there's sort of this women's issues now that are dominating, and then of course the specific issue of abortion rights. So how do you think that's going to play out in the elections next year?
Yeah, I think that's real quick, and Chris can go.
Yeah.
I always hate talking about this as a guy, but look, I think it's abortion is extremely emotional, and it's something that I think most women see as like a very important relationship, either with and a choice that they have to make between with their God and their religion, or they and their doctor, or their family. And that's again, it's always very difficult to layer in politics when talking about something that is deeply emotional and deeply moving on any one of those issues, right? I mean, a person's relationship with their doctor is very important, probably one of the most important relationships they have, right? Or certainly with their God or their religion. And so, these are all very, very complicated issues. But as a result of Dobbs, as you mentioned, this has become a state's issue, and let's say this way, we have not found as a country what that new watermark is going to be on a nationwide basis, as to is there going to be access to abortion? If so, what does that look like? How many weeks does that look like? What are the factors, the gating factors that we're going to require for someone to go through to get an abortion and access? So all of those things are deeply important. Every state's going at their own path. Predictably, the framers of our Constitution were geniuses in so many ways, and having this as a 50-state. Having the 50-state laboratories lean in on this and trying to find some way to, through the grinder, trying to find a way to get to that new water level, what the nationwide consensus is going to be, is we're certainly we're certainly a few cycles off on that, but I'm confident the country will come together and try to find we'll find that watermark eventually. But until then, we're in this deeply divided situation that's going to remain divided until we come closer to that consensus. And we'll drive voters. This is going to drive Democratic voters, I think, significantly. I think the Democratic Party will benefit from this for several cycles.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say this is a great example from a political science perspective, that people have overlapping identities and they are activated to vote and to choose which party based on different identities. So it's not just, I am X demographic and therefore we vote 60% for this party. It's what identity is being activated at this time. And I think what we saw with Dobbs is that there were a lot of women who were pro-choice, but they never needed to vote in a way that was pro-choice, because Roe existed. And Roe was the law of the land. And we had a really high profile example of this in 2014 in Colorado, when Mark Udall tried to make abortion the centerpiece of his campaign. He was actually mocked for it. Say, like, basically, why is he talking about abortion? Roe is the law of the land. It's not going to go away. He's scaremongering. So that he tried to make it an issue. If he had run that campaign in 2022, it would have been a very different response. And so what we saw in the last cycle is a lot of women and men who were pro-choice, but never needed to vote that way. So it kind of sunk down the list of things that they cared about that influenced their voting. Now it's risen to the very top because it is a very immediate and important. And I think what we saw in certain states, like New York State, where it wasn't that big of an issue, it was not clear on the governor's race in New York that it would have had any impact on abortion. You had your kind of typical forecasted midterm race. In other states like Michigan, Wisconsin, where it was very much the winner of this governor's race is going to really affect it, that mattered a lot more. And so you saw a higher Democratic turnout and vote share. I think what's going to happen in 2024 is that Democrats are going to make this an issue, because they will say to the public, we know that you support kind of the Roe standard. We're going to try to go back to that if you give us control of the House and enough senators to break the filibuster. And if Republicans get a trifecta, they're going to pass a national ban. And there are enough Republican elected officials who have spoken about that, or even if it's not the consensus of the party, that will be in political ads. So it is a highly active identity at the moment. It's a highly salient issue. and the Democrats have every incentive to make it an even greater issue in 2024. So, yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to predicting elections, yeah, you generally, as Chris said, you go for the economy, but there are some elections where other issues come to the fore. 2002 with the post 9/11 and pre-Iraq War election was like that. And I think 2022 was probably like that with Dobbs as well. And the question is whether 2024 will be like that as well. I think maybe not as much as 22, but certainly it's going to be a factor and maybe a tipping point in some states that would otherwise be close.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so we're getting some more questions here, which is great. This question is, any thoughts on spending levels for veterans healthcare services, area we're specifically interested in? So I will tell you this, that veterans is very bipartisan. There's only 2 appropriation bills for FY24 that have made it through: the agriculture FDA bill, and then what we call MILCON VA, which is Military Construction and Veterans Affairs. So at least as far as the appropriations process, that bill has support and is moving. So veterans health, I think, is something that is important to both, but I don't have any more details on that. So I don't know if either of my colleagues do, specifically around veterans health. Okay.
I mean, Liz, as you said before, this is a bipartisan issue. This candidly, there's no member of Congress that can spend enough money in this area. That recognizes that there's many demands on the budget, but these are what you hear most politicians say, that these are promises made to those people who are willing to lay down their lives for Americans, and so we owe them this. And so, yeah, again, I think they're, as you noted rightly, so it's typically nonpartisan, and trying to find a way to set those spending limits. That being said, absent VA and MILCON, whatever, and then the Defense Department specifically, I think we're in. Those forecasts we're in for, and Chris too. We're in for. I think it's time where you bring your calculators out and you do the minus side, not the addition or multiplication this year. I think you're dividing and subtracting, and not multiplying and adding.
Yeah. Okay. So next question. Any thoughts on Leader Schumer or the Biden administration and how they will navigate cannabis heading into election cycle? That's another one that a lot of states have been passing all kinds of access to cannabis laws. So what do you guys think about that?
So I think this is definitely a potent electoral strategy. And so you might see it. I don't think there's going to be legislation, but one of the big challenges for the cannabis industry is interstate banking and finance. So I'll turn this over to Chris Campbell, because I think you know the technical aspects of this, but is there something where via executive order, the president could allow cannabis companies to transfer money and use the official banking system without absent legislation passing?
The answer is no. The quick answer is no on that specific issue, but I think that it's fascinating for me. So I have great friends on both sides of this issue. I think it's certainly the momentum is on the side of legalizing marijuana, at least. But you look at states now that have been really upfront and really lean in on the decriminalization of narcotics, and they're Oregon being specifically one of them, and they're looking at like, oh, we may have made a mistake, right? So I think that you have this very interesting, parenthetically, Snoop Dogg is no longer doing marijuana, but it's just you have this weird issue where I think that we may have a collective relook at this and rethinking this. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But I think that there's, data has been very mixed on this, where I think that, early exposure to cannabis and other drugs, especially for adolescents, has been can have had some significant health effects. And so it's going to be fascinating to see how this works its way out. But the momentum definitely is on the side of legalization or decriminalization. But I think it's really hard until there's the scientific community and the medical community really catches up to where those proponents who see a market for selling recreational cannabis and other drugs. I think right now scheduled drugs. I think I think that's there. We're still not there yet, and so it's hard to see a path forward in Congress on this. But I think again, if I were betting on one side, I'd bet on the momentum being on the side of finding some way of reducing the burden, the legal burden on the federal side. But up until then, those who participate in the sale of cannabis are, as Chris Oates said, locked out of the banking system.
Just to follow up on that, it wasn't a question, but it's very similar of sports betting and the legalization of sports betting. Again, it's a big regulatory change happening at the state level. I think we are seeing simultaneously it expanding into various places, and where it is, people started to have restrictions on, again, because they said, well, we let it open and we didn't really have restrictions on how much you can spend on advertising and can you target to children. So I think with a lot of these industries, it's really important if you're in an industry that's kind of novel to expect, even if you get big wins in legalization or access to the governmental system, it may be a few years later restrictions come back in as we learn a bit more. So the regulatory process also matures just like industries do.
Great. Okay. Let's talk about decorum. So recently we had some interesting exchanges. Senator Mullen, former Speaker McCarthy elbowing Burchett. There's just been sort of some members of Congress actually said, oh, I think people just need to go home for Thanksgiving. But what do you think about it? Just seems like it's the nastiness and sort of physicality is sort of increased. What do we think is happening, and is it going to continue, or do you think that it will level off? Chris Oates.
Yeah, I think it's really weird. I think part of it comes down to maybe the rise of social media, having this kind of very more combative, hostile sense. Could be that we have new candidates who haven't been there long enough. It could be just individual idiosyncrasies. I think generally speaking, though, we are seeing a kind of a decades-long shift away from serious-minded people who may be crazy or corrupt, but they know how to act professionally. And we now have a rise of people who basically want to be in Congress so that they could one day get a cable news show or get their own, I don't want to call them grifters, but effectively their job, as they see it, is to get media attention, to get, small dollar donations, to get social clips for social media. And those are not necessarily serious people. I think we can sometimes valorize old Congresses a bit too much. There were a lot of folks that were little more than, common criminals, 100 years ago, but I don't think they were as explicit about it as they are now. I don't know if it's going away, but it is a weird trend.
Yeah, I think we need some marriage counselors to come up and just we need some group therapy sessions, because there's the best way I say this always is that the Congress, especially the House, but the Congress always reflects the mood of the current mood of the nation, right? So the nation gets the Congress that they want and they deserve, right? And it's because they vote these people in, and so I think looking at the Congress, looking at the way it's behaving on both sides, right? We have Democratic senators who are under indictment for literally working on behalf of foreign governments. We have Republican congressmen who are stealing from the president, allegedly stealing from their campaigns. We have U.S. senators that are looking to fight witnesses. I think it's it just reflects the incredibly polarized and just enormously regrettably position that the United States finds itself in, where this deeply polarized, right? I think I totally agree with Chris Oates that I think social media has a lot to do with this, and I think it's deeply corrosive to our democracy. But how do you operate in a free speech environment while still curbing what I think is really deleterious to the democracy with it's kind of social media, and it's so easily manipulated by foreign governments and people who don't want our democracy to work. So I don't know. This is a challenge. We're gonna debate this for a long time. I think we'll make it through, but it's going to be very, very difficult. But again, it's everyone's always frustrated by the level of decorum or lack of in Congress. And I always say the Congress reflects the mood of the American people.
That is true. That is true. All right. So we got just a few minutes here and seeing a couple of questions about, I think, an important issue that maybe people aren't as attuned to because there's so much other noise going on, but the politics of the federal workforce and sort of the ability to fire people who are just doing their job just because you disagree with them. What are your thoughts on that, and how is that impacting the system? And then is that going to trickle out to elections, or do people even care about that? Are they tracking that? And then I finally want to finish off with predictions for the presidential election. So who wants to go first on the civil workforce and politics, and then move on to the presidential?
Well, I'll do
ahead.
it in one. So
Okay.
I don't think people are going to care that much about civil service reform itself, other than it could be wrapped up in a broader issue of Joe Biden attacking Donald Trump as Trump wants to basically be an authoritarian. It would be one data point in that argument. So that's why it could matter if it does. I don't think it itself would. I think a broader issue of the federal workforce is actually in a recent book by Jennifer Palka, who has worked on software projects for the federal government. When do we start to give real autonomy to the bureaucrats who are actually implementing these things? A lot of the times when software projects go wrong in government, it's because they were overprescribed, or there's kind of a defensiveness in policy. Everyone has to always check the boxes because basically you can get fired for not following the process. You're probably not going to get fired if the outcome isn't right, because then you can just say the policy was wrong. So that, I think, is another issue that might be going on, very bubbling under the surface, very wonky right now, but could be an issue for how state, if you're contracting with the government, how that process works and whether the bureaucrats you're dealing with are empowered or not. For a prediction, I will say Biden victory, Democratic House, Republican Senate.
So I think that on civil service stuff, I think it matters mostly to Republican voters. I think that Donald Trump has been able to weaponize, and for good or bad, I think got to remember that actually what really happened was the FBI, like the real FBI, produced a fake document about against Donald Trump, right? I mean, this is not, it's not made up, and it sounds like it is, but it's not, right? So I think that there's, amongst Republican voters, certainly Trump Republican voters, saying that they're very highly skeptical of what the kind of the swamp, or like the civil servants in the government. And Donald Trump has obviously whipped that up. And so I think that for those voters, it matters a lot, right? So the former president is suggesting that he's going to reschedule a lot of those workers and then have them be subject to dismissal, and then he can hire folks that that would that he deems would be worthy of hire. So I think that's less of a motivator for Democrats than it will be for Republicans, but I think it is, and it's not for all Republicans. I think it's for a class of Republicans. Voters, mostly Trump voters, and then predictions. As I said before, I think it's very, very difficult. It's still really early, but for a incumbent president to be facing the poll numbers he is today, again, really early. Polls can change no matter what. It's a snapshot in time, but the momentum being given to Republicans that are not, it's not really front and center right now. I mean, it's covered some in politics, but it's not like it's not dominated the conversation. It's deeply worrying, and obviously it's so I'm interested in Democrats, of course, and so I think that it's I still think given the economy and the headwinds writ large, I think we're going to see just a turn in everything. I think the Democrats take the House, Republicans take the Senate, and I think that a Republican will be in the White House. If it's Joe Biden, if Joe Biden remains running, I think it'll be a Republican in the White House. It looks likely now that Trump will become the nominee, But there's a lot of things that could happen that could change that as well.
Do you guys see Trump in a black and white suit behind bars?
It's a great question. I'll say it this way. I don't know. No one really knows, right? I mean, it's going to be up to the juries and judges. I will say though that, and this is where your typical Democratic voter just doesn't understand, I think, and the typical Republican voter just views very, very differently. If you push away from the table, if you ask a Trump voter if they think that any of the charges that have been brought against the former president would be brought against anyone else if they weren't named Donald Trump, they would say no, absolutely not. It would never happen, which means that there's been a weaponization of the judicial branch, right? And that's very moving to a Trump voter. It's been extremely, extremely motivating, which is why his voters are so sticky. And so Liz, I'll back in your question. I don't know, but I don't think it matters. I think he may win from a jail cell.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I wouldn't be surprised.
All right. On that note, we are going to wrap things up. Thank you for dialing in. Thank you both, Chris and Chris, for incredibly insightful thoughts. Always love these discussions. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. We will see you in 2024. Bye-bye.